They took the raw dough on their journey and baked it in the hot desert sun, making hard crackers called matzo.
Why do we eat bitter herbs at Passover feast? On all other nights we eat many kinds of vegetables and herbs.
The bitter herb, maror, is eaten on this night to remind us of the bitter and cruel way that the Pharaoh treated the Jewish people when they were slaves in Egypt.
Why do we dip our food twice tonight? On all other nights we don't usually dip one morsel of food into another, but tonight we dip the parsley in salt water and the bitter herbs in charoset.
We dip bitter herbs in charoset. Say it.
Charoset.
We dip bitter herbs in charoset to remind us how hard the slaves labored at saying that word, as well as making the mortar and bricks in Egypt. We dip parsley in salt water. The parsley reminds us that spring is here and new life will grow, and the salt water reminds us of the tears shed by the Jewish slaves.
Why do we recline on the pillow tonight?
Well, we lean on a pillow tonight to be comfortable and to remind us that once we were slaves, but now we are free.
Now the festival of unleavened bread, which is called the Passover, was near. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to put Jesus to death, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered into Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers of the temple police about how he might betray him to them. They were greatly pleased and agreed to give him money. So he consented and began to look for an opportunity to betray him to them when no crowd was present.
Sit. What were the chief priests and the scribes afraid of? Well, Luke tells us that they were afraid of the people. Were they afraid of losing control over how the people practiced their religion? Or were they afraid about how they thought about God? Were they afraid that Jesus would whip them up into some kind of a religious fervor and frenzy during the Passover, creating an excuse for the Romans to ride roughshod over the Jews? Plotting to put Jesus to death is something we tend to take personally. But the other side of that coin is this. The Romans ruled the city of Jerusalem. The Roman emperor was a god in his own world. He was a god and the ultimate authority under his law. The emperor Gaius Caesar, for example, also known to you as Caligula, so grossly abused his power that he sought to represent himself as a god and desired to be called such, and so much so that he sent Petronius with an army to Jerusalem to place statues of himself in the Jerusalem temple, the holy place of worship for the Jews, where the one God, Yahweh, was the authority of their lives and their laws. Caligula commanded his governor, in case the Jews would not erect the statues that he wanted to put up of himself in the temple, he told Petronius, well, I want you to kill all of those who oppose me and oppose what I want done. And I want you to carry the rest of them out of the nation into captivity. Well, yes, the chief priests and the scribes feared the Romans. Their fear was legitimate. That is proved in the year 69. The chief priests of the temple and the scribes reasoned that people in large groups can be unpredictable. This is true. It doesn't take much to incite a mob. Have you ever seen a mob? I don't mean on TV. That's frightening enough in itself. Human beings out of control are terrifying. Have you ever marched in a demonstration? You can feel the palpable intensity of emotion that surrounds the marchers and the observers. With the right fuel to ignite them, peaceful demonstrations can turn into out-of-control conflagrations. So, in order to avoid a possible mob scene, the chief priests and the scribes choose the most expedient, that is, the most convenient, and yes, the most self-serving way to take care of the perceived threat. Luke suggests in his text that Satan has found his more opportune time to undermine God's plans.
Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and prepare the Passover meal for us, that we may eat it." They asked him, "Where do you want us to make preparations for it?" "Listen," he said to them, "when you have entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house he enters, and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs already furnished. Make preparations for us there." So they went and found everything as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal.
Luke opens the discourse on preparing for the feast of the unleavened bread, reminding us that this is the day on which the Passover lamb is sacrificed. He continues with the words, so Jesus, as if to conclude in a moment that Jesus, as the Passover lamb to be sacrificed, sends his disciples out to make preparations for it. Like the planned and staged entrance into the city from the Mount of Olives a few days ago, this event is also pre-planned and staged, apparently unbeknownst to Jesus' disciples, since he has to instruct them what they are to do and how they are to find the guest room that is already furnished for its festal purpose. Luke seeks to make us aware that these plans have all been made well in advance of Jesus' arrival in the city. Luke would have us understand that among Jesus' disciples there are people who have the wherewithal and the means to make such arrangements. To have been trying to make arrangements for this very involved feast on the spur of the moment would have found Jesus and the disciples trying to eat their meal on the Mount of Olives. Think about this. Members of this church, members of this congregation and I have been preparing for this Holy Week for months in order to be ready. Ready for us and ready for you. There are literally scores of people involved in these preparations, from the church secretary who's stuffing and stamping envelopes and finding proofreaders and printing bulletins and programs for 7 different services. She is cleaning the sanctuary just this afternoon because no one else has thought to do it. Volunteers have been folding the bulletins and sorting them for stewards and liturgists and worship leaders and readers of all kinds. The music director and the sanctuary choir don't learn a cantata in a couple of days. They have been practicing and preparing since Christmas. The children's events have taken many hours to plan and many a willing and creative hand to prepare. In all of these preparations, there are those who are the supply buyers and the cooks and the servers and the custodians and the gardeners, not to mention the individuals who fixed the ceiling in the fellowship hall. We have been readying ourselves for this day and the next 3 days for some time. And still the question must be asked, with all of this preparation, are we ready for the feast of unleavened bread? Are our hearts ready to hear the words of Jesus, the Passover Lamb, who will give himself up, who sacrifices himself for us, for the love of humankind, this very night?
Simon, listen. Satan has demanded to sift all of you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your own faith may not fail. And you, when once you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. And he said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the cock will not crow this day until you have denied 3 times that you know me. He came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he reached the place, he said to them, pray that you may not come into the time of trial. Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down, and prayed. Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. When he got up for prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping because of grief. And he said to them, why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come into the time of trial.
Luke's Jesus has perhaps seen fear in Simon's eyes, who not long ago stood firm in proclaiming that Jesus was the Messiah of God. What does Jesus see? Is it doubt? Does he see confusion or sadness or disappointment? Luke's Jesus warns Simon that Satan has demanded to sift all of the disciples like wheat. He speaks almost as if he is pleading with Simon to be the one who will realize the consequences of doubt. Jesus asserts that he has prayed specifically for Simon Peter, that his faith may not fail, and goes on to instruct him. And you, when once you have turned back, strengthen your brothers and sisters. Simon Peter is nonplussed, eyes wide in surprise and shocked that Jesus might even suggest that Simon, who has been with Jesus from the very beginning, would be so frightened that his faith in Jesus might fail. He insists that he will go with Jesus. He will go with him no matter what happens. Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. And he says this most emphatically, believing that there is nothing that will keep him from Jesus' side. This exchange between Jesus and Simon Peter calls all who believe themselves secure and comfortable in their faith to re-examine how easy it is for our faith in God, our trust in the will and ways of God to be shaken and threatened. For Simon Peter, a terrible fear overtook all of his best intentions. But Jesus had said something so very important to Simon Peter, something that Peter may not have heard. Jesus trusts that Simon, the man, will discover something incredible as a consequence of his denial. Jesus believes that Simon will discover a faith and determination stronger than he had ever imagined. And when he turns back again with strength to the other disciples, Jesus knows who Peter believed. Jesus has already identified Simon as being stronger than he himself even knows. Simon Peter could not know at the time what Jesus was telling him. It would take time for him to remember. For now, Simon and the other disciples are about to be sifted like wheat. Even though Simon was formerly a fisherman, he knows very well how wheat is sifted, how the good edible grain is separated from the chaff. The wheat is spread out on a stone floor, and it is beaten with a flail to loosen the chaff. The chaff is removed from the grain and thrown into the air, where it is taken away by the wind. Luke deliberately places this image in the minds of the reader as we wonder, will Jesus' disciples be the chaff that is blown away by the wind, or will they endure as good grain? With this imagery, we are to understand that although Simon Peter may not stand before the Sanhedrin, he will be tried in his own heart and mind and will be found guilty. But will his denial of Jesus, his failed faith, his falling away be the end? No matter what he may think of himself, God offers better. These few verses in Luke's Gospel, spoken to the most willing of Jesus' followers, remind us today that when we get worn out with trying, when we doubt, when doubt will have its way with us, when we are caught up in grief that we cannot break away from, we may find our hearts unwilling to accept God's grace. But God offers better. And with God, the end is never the end.
While he was still speaking, suddenly a crowd came, and the one called Judah, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, is it with a kiss that you are betraying the Son of Man? When those who were around him saw what was coming, they asked, Lord, should we strike with the sword? Then one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the and the elders who had come for him, "Have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a bandit? When I was with you the day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness." Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. But Peter was following at a distance. When they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him in the fire, stared at him and said, "This man also was with him." But he denied, saying, "Woman, I do not know." A little later, someone else, on seeing him, said, "You also are one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." Then about an hour later, yet another kept insisting, "Surely this man also was with him, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." At that moment, while he was still speaking, the cock crowed. The Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly.
What will you remember? This evening you have heard the plot of the chief priests and the scribes. You have been present at the Last Supper and heard Jesus' warning to Peter. You've witnessed his anxious, thrice-voiced prayer on the Mount of Olives. You have imagined in your mind's eye the sleepy grief of the disciples who could not bear to see or listen to Jesus' tormented prayer. You have witnessed the betrayal by Judas and the arrest of Jesus as he was seized and dragged off to the house of the high priest. You have watched the trial with Peter. Watched, standing next to him as he told the staring servant girl that he was not with Jesus. "I do not know him." Again, you stood with him as a man looked and said, "You also are one of them." Did you say with Peter, "Man, I am not"? And like him, did you think that you had escaped further notice when still another of the trial observers picked Peter out of the crowd and said, "Surely this man was with him, for he is a Galilean"? In that moment, perhaps you looked at Peter and you wondered how it was that he stood out in the crowd. Do Galileans look so different from the rest? And then, in his telltale Galilean accent, Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." Luke tells us that it was while Peter was still speaking, still denying that he knew Jesus, that the cock crowed. And Jesus turned and looked at Peter. Imagine, if you will, the look that passed between them as their eyes met in that moment. So I ask you, what will you remember about tonight's story? Peter is remembering only that Jesus said he would deny him. that your faith would not fail. And you, when once you have turned back, strengthen your brothers and sisters. Jesus has made it clear for those who have ears to hear. Peter will not deny Christ forever and always. Peter will turn back once again. Peter will somehow, in his grief and very personal anguish, return to the rest of the disciples who were with Jesus and help them move on. One of Jesus' last prayers was for Peter and the rest. My friends, Jesus prayed for them before he prayed for himself. He has already prayed the prayer that is for all. It was a prayer for you and a prayer for me, that your faith will not fail. Tonight, let us remember that. Tonight, let us have the same confidence in our faith that Jesus had. For he knows that even in the midst of grief and in the midst of shame, we will turn again to him. And by our turning, by our example, we will strengthen our brothers and our sisters.